And now, Johnny Harelow in Bunnytown, The Shadow's Birth, brought to you by TCM Productions.
My name's Johnny Harelow, and I've learned that sometimes the cases that haunt you the most are the ones that give birth to something greater than you could have imagined. 3 years ago, I failed to solve a murder that should have been simple. That failure created Bunnytown's most effective guardian and taught me that justice doesn't always wear a badge. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with Maria Whiskers, the mouse who walked into my office on a Tuesday morning carrying a manila folder thick with threats and a story I'd heard before. Maria was small, even for a mouse, but she had the kind of steady gaze that told you she'd seen too much of the world's ugliness to be easily intimidated. She wore a simple dress and carried herself with the dignity of someone who'd spent her life fighting for others. "Mr. Harelow, I need your help." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Someone's trying to scare me out of my neighborhood, and the police say there's nothing they can do about anonymous phone calls." I poured myself a cup of carrot coffee and settled behind my desk. "Tell me about it." She opened the manila folder and spread its contents across my desk. Photographs of her apartment building with red X's spray-painted on the walls. Copies of threatening letters slipped under doors throughout her building. Phone logs showing calls at all hours with no one speaking when residents answered. "I run the Riverside Community Organization. We're fighting against Apex Development Corporation. They want to tear down our entire neighborhood to build luxury condos." The name Apex Development didn't ring any immediate bells, but the pattern was achingly familiar. Corporate predators using intimidation to clear out residents who couldn't afford lawyers or political connections. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, studying the photographs. 3 weeks. It started right after we filed our petition with the City Planning Commission." Maria's small hands trembled slightly as she pointed to the most recent threats. "Yesterday, someone threw a brick through my kitchen window. The note tied to it said I had 48 hours to stop organizing my neighbors." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air seeping through my office windows. Something about Maria's story was triggering a memory I'd spent 3 years trying to forget. "Maria, has anyone else been targeted specifically? Any other community leaders?" "Mrs. Rodriguez, who runs the after-school program. Mr. Kim, who organized our petition drive. They're all getting the same treatment." She paused, studying my face. "Mr. Harelow, you look like you've heard this story before." I had heard it before. Every detail, every escalation pattern, every systematic effort to terrorize community organizers into silence. I'd heard it 3 years ago from a rabbit named Elena Meadows, and I'd failed to protect her. "Maria, I'm going to take your case, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't end the way the last one did." After Maria left, I sat alone in my office for a long time, staring at the locked filing cabinet in the corner where I kept the cases that still haunted me. Finally, I walked over and retrieved a file I hadn't opened in months. The tab read, "Elena Meadows, Unsolved Homicide." Elena Meadows had been 26 years old when someone killed her in an alley 6 blocks from the Southside Community Center where she worked. 3 years later, I could still remember every detail of that crime scene, the way the rain had soaked through her jacket, the careful positioning that was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong, the complete absence of any evidence that would lead to her killer. But Elena's murder hadn't started in that alley. It had started months earlier, when Crescent Development Corporation announced plans to revitalize the Southside District. Like Maria Santos today, Elena had organized her community to fight back against gentrification disguised as urban improvement. Elena had been everything I'd expected from a social worker. Passionate, idealistic, convinced that the system could work if good people pushed hard enough. She'd also been something I hadn't expected. Deeply in love with Pete Cottontail, heir to one of Bunnytown's oldest and wealthiest families. I'd met Pete the morning after Elena's body was found. He'd shown up at the crime scene still wearing evening clothes from some charity gala, his expensive suit wrinkled and his eyes red from crying. The sight of his grief had been almost as shocking as the crime itself. I'd rarely seen such raw pain from someone who supposedly had everything money could buy. "She was going to expose him," Pete had told me that first morning, his voice hoarse from hours of tears. Elena found evidence that Crescent Development was bribing city officials to condemn buildings that weren't actually unsafe. She was going to a meeting with the city attorney yesterday morning. What kind of evidence? Financial records, photographs of documents, recordings of phone conversations. Pete had looked at me with desperate hope. "She kept copies of everything in a safety deposit box. I can show you." But when we'd gotten to the bank, the safety deposit box had been empty. Elena's apartment had been ransacked. Her office at the community center had been burglarized. Every piece of evidence she'd gathered had vanished, along with the woman who'd collected it. That should have been my first clue that Elena Meadows hadn't died in a random street crime. But I was still naive enough to believe that evidence and determination were enough to find justice in a system designed to protect the guilty. Pete Cottontail had surprised me from the beginning. I'd expected another spoiled rich kid playing its social consciousness, but what I'd found was a rabbit genuinely transformed by love and loss. Elena had been teaching him about the real world, the world where elderly animals chose between medicine and food, where families were evicted to make room for luxury developments, where community centers closed because their funding mysteriously disappeared. Pete had been a willing student, using his wealth and connections to support Elena's activism. "I never understood how the system really worked," Pete had told me during one of our early conversations. "I thought charity galas and foundation donations were enough. Elena showed me that sometimes the very people writing checks for charity are the same ones creating the problems in the first place." After Elena's murder, Pete had thrown himself into finding her killer with the same intensity he'd once reserved for polo matches and investment strategies. He'd hired the best private investigators money could buy. He'd offered increasingly large rewards for information. He'd used his family's political connections to pressure the police department for results. None of it had worked. The private investigators had hit the same bureaucratic walls that blocked my official investigation. The rewards had generated dozens of false leads, but no useful information. The political pressure had resulted in meetings and task forces that produced reports nobody read and recommendations nobody implemented. Meanwhile, Crescent Development had continued their systematic destruction of the South Side community. Buildings were condemned on fabricated safety violations. Residents were evicted with minimal notice. The community center where Elena had worked was demolished to make room for a parking lot that would serve the luxury condominiums being built on the graves of displaced families. I'd watched Pete's transformation during those months of frustration. The grieving boyfriend had hardened into something more focused and dangerous. He'd stopped attending social events. He'd cut his hair short and started working out obsessively. Most telling of all, he'd begun asking me technical questions about crime scene investigation, surveillance techniques, and evidence gathering. The legal system failed Elena, he'd told me, after the district attorney had officially closed the case due to lack of evidence. But that doesn't mean justice is impossible. It just means justice has to come from somewhere else. I'd thought he was talking about private investigators or civil lawsuits. I had no idea he was planning to become something entirely different. Looking back, I should have recognized the signs of institutional sabotage earlier. But 3 years ago, I'd still believed that incompetence was more likely than corruption, that bureaucratic delays were more common than deliberate obstruction. Elena's murder investigation had been assigned to Detective Lieutenant Bruce Badger, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for closing cases quickly. At first, I'd been optimistic about working with Badger. He'd seemed thorough and professional, asking all the right questions and following standard procedures. But the case had started falling apart almost immediately. Key witness statements had disappeared from police files. Security camera footage from businesses near the crime scene had been accidentally erased before it could be analyzed. Physical evidence had been contaminated or lost during processing. Every lead had dried up within days of being discovered. Meanwhile, Badger had seemed increasingly eager to classify Elena's death as a random street crime. When I'd suggested investigating her activism as a possible motive, he'd dismissed the idea as conspiracy thinking. When I'd pointed out the suspicious timing of her murder just hours before her meeting with the city attorney, he'd attributed it to coincidence. "Look, Harelow," Badger had told me after I'd pressed him about the missing evidence, "sometimes bad things happen to good people for no reason. This rabbit was in the wrong place at the wrong time. We're not going to find her killer by chasing corporate conspiracy theories." But I'd known Badger was wrong. Elena hadn't been killed randomly. She'd been murdered systematically by professionals who understood how to make evidence disappear and investigations stall. The breakthrough had come when I'd started investigating Badger himself. A little financial digging had revealed that the detective had recently made some expensive purchases: a new car, a boat, a down payment on a vacation home, all of them paid for with cash, none of them consistent with a police detective's salary. More digging had revealed Badger's connection to a consulting firm that worked exclusively for development companies navigating complex regulatory environments. The same consulting firm that counted Crescent Development as its most valued clients. Elena Meadows hadn't just been murdered by street criminals. She'd been killed by a network of corruption that reached into the police department itself, protected by officials whose job was supposed to be finding her killer. By the time I'd gathered enough evidence to expose Badger's corruption, the detective had taken early retirement and moved to a non-extradition jurisdiction. The consulting firm had dissolved and reformed under a different name. Crescent Development had completed their South Side project and moved on to gentrifying other neighborhoods. Elena's murder had been officially solved when a career criminal had confessed to her killing in exchange for a plea deal on unrelated charges. The criminal had died in prison 3 months later, taking any possibility of learning the truth with him to his grave. Case closed. Justice served. Everyone could move on, except Pete Cottontail. The deeper I dug into Elena's murder, the clearer it had become that she'd stumbled onto something much larger than simple development fraud. Crescent Development hadn't just been bribing city officials to approve questionable building projects. They'd been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened their operations. Elena had been the third community organizer to die under suspicious circumstances in the past 2 years. Before her, there had been Samuel O'Possum, a tenant rights activist who died in a suspicious house fire just days before testifying about rental fraud. Before Samuel, there had been Dorothy Sparrow, an elderly bird who'd organized her neighbors against predatory reverse mortgage schemes and had died in a hit-and-run accident that was never solved. All three had been investigating different aspects of the same corrupt network. All three had died just as their investigations were reaching critical stages. All three had been dismissed by police as victims of random crimes in a dangerous city. But Pete had seen the pattern that everyone else had missed or chosen to ignore. Using his family's resources and social connections, he'd traced the financial networks that connected seemingly separate development companies, consulting firms, and political organizations. What he'd found was a web of corruption that touched every level of Bunnytown's government and business community. Crescent Development was just one tentacle of an octopus whose head was buried deep in the city's power structure. The same consulting firm that had bought Detective Badger's cooperation also provided services to the Planning Commission that approved development projects. The same law firm that defended Crescent's interests also represented the mayor's office in regulatory matters. The same investment bank that financed luxury developments also managed the pension funds of city employees. Elena had died because she'd discovered how to expose this entire network. Her evidence hadn't just threatened one development project. It had threatened to unravel decades of systematic corruption that had enriched dozens of powerful people at the expense of Bunnytown's most vulnerable residents. They killed her because she was going to bring down the whole system, Pete had told me during one of our last official conversations. But Elena's evidence is still out there. It has to be. And when I find it, every one of these bastards is going to pay for what they did to her. I'd tried to talk him out of continuing his private investigation. I'd explained how dangerous these people were, how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. I'd pointed out that Elena's murder proved they wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who threatened them. But Pete had been beyond reasoning with. Elena's death had ignited something in him that couldn't be extinguished by logic or warnings. He'd loved her, and she'd been murdered, and the system that was supposed to protect her had instead protected her killers. The law failed Elena. Politics failed her. Money failed her. Everything I was taught to believe in failed her. But that doesn't mean she can't still get justice. It just means justice is going to come from outside the system. That had been the last time I'd spoken with Pete Cottontail, the grieving boyfriend and heir to a fortune. The next time I'd encountered him, he'd become something else entirely. Pete had disappeared from Bunnytown's social scene about 6 months after Elena's murder. The society pages had speculated about his absence from charity galas and family functions, but most people had assumed he was traveling or dealing with his grief in private. I'd known better. Pete hadn't been grieving. He'd been preparing. The first sign that something had changed had come in the form of an unmarked envelope slipped under my office door. Inside had been high-quality photographs of financial documents that showed systematic fraud in the city's building inspection department. The photos had been taken in locations that would have required professional-level breaking and entering skills to access. At the bottom of the envelope had been a small black calling card, a silhouette of a leaping rabbit. More envelopes had followed over the next several weeks. Each had contained evidence of corruption related to Elena's murder and the broader network that had killed her. Building inspection reports that had been falsified to justify condemnations. Financial records showing bribes paid to city officials. Correspondence between development companies and the consultant firms that provided their regulatory services. All of the evidence had been gathered from secure locations, corporate offices, government buildings, private homes of public officials. Someone was conducting a systematic investigation using methods that no legitimate law enforcement agency could legally employ. The evidence had been accompanied by detailed analyses that showed connections between seemingly separate cases of corruption. Someone with significant investigative skills and intimate knowledge of Bunnytown's power structure was mapping the entire network that had killed Elena Meadows. I'd known who was behind the investigation, of course. The rabbit's silhouette had been a dead giveaway. But it had taken months before I'd gotten confirmation. The meeting had been arranged through a coded message left in my mailbox. Instructions to be on the roof of the Mercantile Building at midnight on a specific date. I'd followed the instructions, partly out of curiosity and partly out of professional obligation. When I'd climbed to the roof that night, I'd found a figure waiting in the shadows near the building's edge. He'd been wearing all black, a tactical suit that looked like military gear adapted for urban operations. A mask had covered the upper half of his face, but his rabbit ears had been clearly visible. "Hello, Johnny," he'd said, and I'd recognized Pete's voice despite the electronic distortion device he'd been using. "Pete," I kept my own voice level, professional. "Interesting career change." He'd stepped into the light from a nearby street lamp, and I'd gotten my first good look at what Pete Cottontail had become. The expensive suits and casual wealth had been replaced by functional equipment and obvious physical conditioning. This wasn't the grieving rich boy I'd known. This was someone who'd transformed himself into a weapon. "Elena believed the system could work if good people pushed hard enough," he'd said. "She was wrong. But that doesn't mean justice is impossible. It just means justice has to come from outside the system." "And you think you're justice?" I asked. "I think I'm someone who can go places and do things that you can't do legally." He gestured toward the envelope of evidence I'd been carrying. "That information came from sources you could never access with a warrant. It documents crimes that no official investigation could uncover." He'd been right, of course. The evidence he'd been providing had been far more detailed and damaging than anything I'd been able to gather through official channels. But it had also been obtained through methods that would make it inadmissible in any court. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Partnership. You work within the system, I work outside it. You provide legal framework for the evidence I gather. I provide access to information you can't obtain legally." I studied his face, trying to see the Pete Cottontail I'd known beneath the mask and electronic voice distortion. "And if I say no?" "Then you say no, and I continue working alone. But Elena's killers still get exposed, and Bunnytown's corruption still gets cleaned up. The only question is whether you want to be a part of the solution or just a witness to it." That night, I'd made a decision that had changed everything about how I approached justice in Bunnytown. I'd agreed to work with the Phantom Hare, the name Pete had chosen for his new identity, in an unofficial partnership that existed outside legal channels but served the cause of justice more effectively than anything I'd been able to accomplish alone. Working with the Phantom Hare had been unlike any partnership I had experienced in 20 years of law enforcement. Pete had transformed himself into something that was part detective, part commando, and part social activist. He'd used his family's wealth to acquire equipment and training that most law enforcement agencies couldn't afford, and he'd used his elite social connections to infiltrate networks of corruption that no official investigation could penetrate. Most importantly, he'd maintained the moral clarity that Elena had instilled in him. The Phantom Hare didn't just fight crime. He specifically targeted predators who preyed on the vulnerable populations Elena had dedicated her life to protecting. Our first major collaboration had been the systematic destruction of Crescent Development Corporation. Over the course of 6 months, the Phantom Hare had gathered evidence of every corrupt practice the company had used to enrich itself at the expense of Bunnytown's poorest residents. The evidence had appeared simultaneously at multiple newspapers, television stations, prosecutors' offices, and federal agencies. financial records showing bribes to city officials, recorded conversations detailing plans to eliminate troublesome community organizers, contracts with consulting firms that specialized in problem resolution and regulatory compliance. Most damaging of all had been the evidence directly connecting Crescent Development to Elena's murder. The Phantom Hare had obtained correspondence between company executives and the consulting firm that had hired the assassin who'd killed Elena. The communications had made it clear that her murder had been ordered and paid for as a routine business expense. Within a week of the evidence being released, Crescent Development's executives had been arrested on charges ranging from fraud to conspiracy to commit murder. The company itself had been dissolved, its assets seized to provide restitution for the communities it had destroyed. The consulting firm had been exposed as a front for organized crime activities, its leadership facing decades in prison. Most satisfying of all, Detective Bruce Badger had been extradited from his comfortable retirement to face charges of obstruction of justice and accessory to murder. The investigation had revealed that his corruption had extended far beyond Elena's case, encompassing dozens of murders and crimes that had been buried to protect powerful interests. Elena Meadows had finally gotten justice, but it had taken a vigilante operating outside the law to deliver what the legal system had been unable or unwilling to provide. "She would have been proud of what you've become," I told Pete after the last of Crescent's executives had been convicted. "She would have been horrified by my methods, but I think she would have understood why they were necessary." We'd been standing on the same rooftop where we'd first met as partners, looking out over the South Side district where Elena had lived and worked. The neighborhood had been transformed since Crescent's fall. Families had moved back into homes they'd been forced to abandon. Community centers had reopened, and new businesses had emerged to serve residents instead of displacing them. "What happens now?" I'd asked. The Phantom Hare adjusted toward the city sprawling below us, where lights in countless windows represented lives and families and dreams that were still vulnerable to predators like Crescent. "Crescent was just one company, Johnny. The system that protected them is still out there, still preying on people who can't defend themselves. Elena's work isn't finished. It's just beginning." The fall of Crescent Development had sent shock waves through Bunnytown's corrupt establishment that were still being felt 3 years later. The evidence the Phantom Hare had gathered hadn't just exposed one company's crimes. It had revealed the systematic nature of corruption that touched every level of government and business. Federal investigations had been launched into dozens of related cases. City officials had resigned or been arrested. Development companies had been dissolved or restructured under federal oversight. The consulting firm that had arranged Elena's murder had been revealed as a front for a network of organized crime activities that stretched across multiple states. But the most significant change had been psychological rather than legal. Bunnytown's predators had learned that their crimes could be exposed by someone willing to work outside the system, someone who could access their private communications and financial records, regardless of legal protections. The Phantom Hare had become a legend in the city's underworld, a figure who appeared in shadows and left evidence of corruption for prosecutors to find. Corporate executives had started hiring personal security. Politicians had begun using encrypted communications. The wealthy and powerful had learned to fear that their secrets might be exposed by a rabbit in a mask who owed allegiance to no institution except justice. For community organizers like Elena had been, the Phantom Hare had become something else, a guardian who watched over them when the official system failed. Maria Santos might not know it, but she was alive today because her situation had triggered memories of Elena Meadows' murder and prompted me to reach out to my unconventional partner. The Phantom Hare had been investigating Apex Development Corporation for weeks before Maria had walked into my office. He'd already identified the same patterns of intimidation and corruption that had killed Elena. More importantly, he'd already begun gathering the evidence that would expose Apex's crimes before they could escalate to murder. They're using the same playbook as Crescent, the Phantom Hare had told me during our meeting the night after Maria had hired me. The same consulting firm, the same intimidation tactics, even some of the same personnel. These people don't learn. They just move from one company to another and continue the same criminal practices. Can you stop them? I can expose them. Whether that stops them depends on whether the prosecutors I give the evidence to are more honest than the ones who buried Elena's case. I learned to trust the Phantom Hare's judgment about such things. In 3 years of working together, he developed an impressive network of contacts in law enforcement, journalism, and federal agencies. More importantly, he'd learned to present evidence in ways that made it impossible for corrupt officials to ignore or suppress. 2 days after my conversation with the Phantom Hare, Apex Development Corporation was raided by federal agents acting on a warrant based on evidence gathered by persons unknown. The company's executives had been arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Their assets had been frozen pending investigation. Most importantly for Maria Whiskers and her neighbors, the intimidation campaign had stopped immediately. The anonymous phone calls had ended. The threats had ceased. The spray-painted X's had been painted over by residents who no longer feared retribution for maintaining their homes. Justice had been served quickly and effectively by a system that had learned to work with a guardian who operated in shadows. Sitting in my office 3 years after Elena Meadows' murder, I'd had time to reflect on what I'd learned about justice, corruption, and the price of moral compromise. Elena had died believing that the system could be reformed from within, that good people working through legal channels could overcome institutional corruption. She'd been wrong, but she'd also been right in ways she couldn't have imagined. The system couldn't be reformed from within because the corruption was too deep and the incentives for maintaining it were too strong. But it could be pressured from outside by someone willing to work in shadows where official law enforcement couldn't follow. The Phantom Hare had succeeded where Elena's legal activism had failed, but only because her death had provided him with the moral clarity and emotional drive necessary to sustain a war against institutional corruption. Her idealism had been transformed into his pragmatic vigilantism, her faith in official justice becoming his commitment to unofficial protection for the vulnerable. Working with the Phantom Hare had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about the system I'd spent my career serving. Sometimes evidence obtained illegally was the only way to expose legal corruption. Sometimes justice required operating outside the law to protect people the law had failed. I'd never become comfortable with those truths, but I learned to live with them. Elena Meadows had deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. The fact that she'd been murdered to protect corrupt officials was a failure that no legal technicality could excuse. The Phantom Hare existed because the system had failed Elena Meadows, but he protected people like Maria Whiskers because Elena's legacy demanded that such failures never happen again. Is it worth it? I'd asked him during one of our conversations about the moral compromises our partnership required. Elena died believing in a system that betrayed her, he'd replied. Every person we protect from that kind of betrayal makes her death mean something. Every corrupt official we expose honors her memory. Every vulnerable family that stays in their home because predators know we're watching validates everything she fought for. I'd never found a better answer to the moral questions our partnership raised. Elena Meadows had died trying to protect people the system didn't value. The Phantom Hare had been born to continue that protection using methods the system couldn't or wouldn't employ. Justice didn't always wear a badge or follow legal procedures. Sometimes justice wore a mask and worked in shadows, driven by love and loss and the absolute conviction that everyone deserved dignity and safety in their own communities. The Apex development case had been resolved with characteristic efficiency. Within a week of the federal raids, the company's executives had been indicted on multiple felony charges. Their assets had been seized to provide restitution for the communities they'd targeted. Most importantly, the systematic intimidation of community organizers had ended completely. Maria Whiskers had returned to my office to thank me for my work, but we'd both known that the real credit belonged to forces operating outside official channels. "I heard rumors," she'd said carefully, "that someone else was investigating Apex before you took my case. Someone who works in shadows." I maintained the professional discretion that had become second nature after 3 years of partnership with the Phantom Hare. I can't comment on ongoing investigations or the sources of information that led to successful prosecutions. Maria had smiled knowingly. "Of course not. But if you happen to be in contact with this someone, please tell them that the families of Riverside District are grateful for their protection." That evening I'd met with the Phantom Hare on our usual rooftop to discuss the resolution of the Apex case and plan for future operations. "Maria Santos asked me to pass along her thanks," I told him. "She doesn't need to thank me. Protecting people like her is why I exist." I studied his face, still struck by how completely Pete Cottontail had transformed himself into this guardian figure. "Do you ever regret what you've become?" "I regret that it was necessary. I regret that Elena had to die before I understood what justice really required." He'd paused, looking out over the city, where countless lights represented lives that might need protection. "But I don't regret choosing to become someone who can provide that protection." The Phantom Hare had evolved significantly since our first partnership. He'd developed an extensive network of informants throughout Bunnytown's criminal and political establishments. He'd established relationships with honest journalists and prosecutors who could be trusted with sensitive evidence. Most importantly, he'd learned to coordinate his activities with official law enforcement in ways that maximized the effectiveness of both approaches. "What's next?" I'd asked. He'd handed me a folder containing preliminary intelligence about a new case, a scheme involving predatory lending practices targeting elderly animals with fixed incomes, the same vulnerable population that Elena had dedicated her life to protecting. "Same mission, different methods," he'd said. "Elena fought corruption through community organizing and legal advocacy. I fight it through investigation and evidence gathering that doesn't depend on the cooperation of corrupt officials." I accepted the folder, knowing it would lead to another successful prosecution and another group of vulnerable people protected from predators. "She would be proud of what you've accomplished," I'd said to him. "She would be proud that her work continues, even if she might not approve of all my methods." The Phantom Hare had prepared to leave, his cape flowing dramatically in the night breeze. "Justice doesn't always look the way we expect it to, Johnny, but it always serves the same purpose, protecting the innocent from those who would harm them." As he disappeared into the shadows between buildings, I'd reflected on how much had changed since Elena Meadows' murder. The system that had failed her still existed, but it now operated under the watchful eyes of someone who couldn't be bought, intimidated, or corrupted. Bunnytown had a guardian who worked in shadows, motivated by love and loss and an absolute commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Elena Meadows' death had created the Phantom Hare, but her life's work had given him the moral foundation to use his power responsibly. 3 months have passed since Maria Santos walked into my office with her story of intimidation and fear. Apex Development Corporation has been dissolved, its executives serving lengthy prison sentences for their crimes. The Riverside District remains a thriving community where working families can afford to live in dignity. Maria has returned to her work as a community organizer, but now she operates with the knowledge that someone watches over people like her when the system fails them. Other community leaders throughout Bunnytown have learned the same lesson, that corruption can be exposed and predators can be stopped by someone willing to work outside legal constraints. The Phantom Hare has become something of an urban legend in the 3 years since Elena's murder gave birth to his mission. Corporate executives whisper about break-ins that leave no trace except damaging evidence in the hands of prosecutors. Politicians check their communications obsessively, knowing that private conversations might become public if they involve schemes to harm vulnerable populations. But in neighborhoods like Riverside and Southside, the Phantom Hare represents something different. Hope that justice exists even when official systems fail. Protection that doesn't depend on political connections or expensive lawyers. I've learned to live with the moral complexities of our partnership. The evidence the Phantom Hare gathers through illegal methods has resulted in hundreds of criminal convictions and the protection of thousands of innocent people. The system he operates outside has become more effective because it knows someone is watching, someone who can expose corruption that official investigations might miss. Elena Meadows died believing that justice could be achieved through legal channels and community activism. Her death proved that belief was naive, but her legacy transformed that naivete into something more practical and more effective. The Phantom Hare exists because Elena Meadows was murdered for trying to protect her community. But he protects communities throughout Bunnytown because her death taught him that justice sometimes requires operating in shadows where the law fears to tread. My name is Johnny Harelow, and in a city where the system sometimes fails the vulnerable, I'm here to work with whatever forces serve justice, whether they wear badges or masks, whether they work in daylight or shadows. Because in the end, what matters isn't how justice is delivered, but that it's delivered to those who need it most. Elena Meadows' death created Bunnytown's most effective guardian. Her life's work gave him the moral foundation to use his power for protection rather than revenge. And her memory continues to guide both of us in a mission that transcends legal procedures and official channels, ensuring that no one else dies alone in an alley because they dared to fight for justice. The case files never truly close in this city, but sometimes, if you're willing to work with the shadows as well as the light, you can make sure the predators don't win. And that's enough to honor Elena Meadows' legacy, one protected community at a time.
Join us next time for another thrilling adventure of Johnny Harelow in Bunnytown.